Coal miners have launched a class action against global mining giants BHP Billiton, Seriti Power and South 32. The workers claim to have suffered from the health impacts of years-long exposure to coal mine dust. Dependents of deceased workers are also part of the class action. Let's get more details now from the attorney representing the miners, Richard Spoor. Richard, thank you so much for joining us on SA Tonight. So you filed this application for classification of a class action suit, and these are several global mining companies. What's the basis or the foundation of the case?
The foundation is really that over a period of about 60 years, which is the period covered by our class action, these companies neglected the health and the safety of coal mine workers, exposed them to harmful quantities of dust and gas underground, and caused them to become sick and many of them to die. It's part of the legacy of cheap labor, migrant labor. It's part of the legacy of apartheid that we're attempting to address to achieve some kind of modicum of justice for these workers and their families.
How big is the presence in South Africa of the companies you aim to hold to account?
It's sizable. It's one of four, it's a group of four of the biggest coal mining companies in the country. The others are Exxaro, Glencore, and Anglo Coal, and we're preparing similar applications to file against them. So the intention really is to wrap up all the major players in the South African coal mining industry, and in particular those ones who have contributed to this legacy of disease and hardship.
We know the mining sector is one of the largest employers in the South African economy. So over a period of 60 years, I can only imagine that, you know, the amount of miners who've been affected is staggering. How many applicants and their families are represented currently in this case?
Well, because it's a class action, we have a representative group of miners who seek permission to represent a much larger class. But over the last several years, we've interviewed, had medically examined about 1,500 former coal mine workers across the sector to get a fair sample and a fair measure of the prevalence of disease and their distribution between these different companies. So we expect that there are several tens of thousands of former mine workers who will participate in these proceedings.
Something like health cannot, in many cases, and especially where lungs are concerned, be restored through action like this. But what kind of compensation are you seeking?
It's true. These diseases are incurable. They're progressive, so they slowly get worse, and quite oftentimes they result in your dying prematurely. We have precedents for damages. You know, over the last several decades, it's taken that long. We've litigated on behalf of asbestos miners, and we've litigated on behalf of gold mine workers suffering from another type of lung disease called silicosis. And in the silicosis litigation, we set a kind of a standard, I think, for these types of lung diseases. So it's we are looking, if you like, for a settlement that covers a range of degrees of disability and different compensation, but in the range of somewhere between 100,000 Rand for minor, relatively minor injury, up to R1 million for people who've been severely impaired.
And then, of course, families of deceased miners who died as a result of these health complications will also form part of this case. I want to try and understand how cases in South Africa compare to global instances of compensation for similar situations.
South Africa has severely neglected the statutory compensation regime. So typically occupational injuries and diseases are compensated for under statutory regimes, a workman's compensation legislation. But for historical reasons pertaining to the political and economic influence of the mining industry, the compensation that was provided to mine workers who developed these lung diseases, which is one of the most common cause of occupational diseases, were not given the same kind of benefits that industrial workers were. So the maximum benefit to which a coal mine worker is entitled who suffers severe lung disease or dies is about 150,000 rand. That's the maximum to which he's entitled. He's not entitled to, and he doesn't receive any compensation for the medical costs associated with this, and he doesn't receive any compensation if his career is cut short, as it frequently is by this type of disease. So in the United States, the United Kingdom, Europe, there is typically effective compensation schemes to ensure that people who become ill through no fault of their own, but by contributing their labor productively to society, are fairly compensated and looked after. Unfortunately, that's not the case in South Africa, and this remains a group who are severely disadvantaged by the status quo, shall we call it.
Given the scale and scope of mining operations in South Africa, what would the knock-on effect be on the mining sector of a successful outcome in this case?
Look, the coal mining sector is booming. It's a fairly chaotic sector of late. There are a lot of big changes taking place. But energy prices are soaring. They're extremely profitable. They cannot export the coal fast enough to make money. It's an extremely lucrative sector. So I don't believe that this kind of litigation poses any threat to the economic viability of the sector. I believe that there's a moral, a social debt, an obligation that the sector needs to pay, and I think the sector is well capable of doing that.
Thank you so much for that update and for your insights on the issue. Richard Spoor, attorney representing the miners in this class action suit.